Joe Bolen, and today we're going to look at subroutines and functions in VisualBasic.net. Now, since 1964, a keyword called GoSub was available, which meant go to a subroutine. Today, the subroutine or procedure has evolved in VisualBasic.net, and also we have available to us a function which acts very similar to a subroutine, but is coded a little bit differently. So let's learn the differences between the subroutine and the function and how to use them, and we'll discover that they're very valuable in our programming techniques. I have on the screen a PowerPoint presentation about subroutines and functions. And let's take a look first of all at subroutines. Subroutines perform some kind of action, and we'll see that as we code and look at our example. The subroutine begins with a access modifier like public, friend, or private. Most of the times in our class we'll define it as a private access modifier. Then we'll follow it by the keyword sub on that. This is a shortening of subroutine, but it means the sub routine that we're going to be running. Now, a subroutine can, and not necessarily, define one or more parameters and receive arguments from the calling code. So we will see many times that we'll pass parameters into our program, and we'll see those defined, but not necessarily. The parameter list, though, of the subroutine establishes the number of parameters, their type, and their sequence. And the calling program that calls the subroutine must match those with the same type and sequence. Now, we can have those values come in by value, which is a copy from the calling statement, or by ref, where we actually get the memory address of the variable being passed into it. And if we modify anything in the program or in that section of the routine, that will also affect that variable outside the particular calling section of the subroutine. Now, subroutines are generally used to set properties for a series of objects, and we'll see that, and you're probably already familiar with it, and I'll point that out as we go into our program. Now, let's take a look at a subroutine. This is just a very generic example. Here is our subroutine with the access modifier private coded first, then the sub keyword, and then we can give it any name that we'd like to define. Here I called it subname just for an example. And then we have the by-val default way that we define what the parameter is, and then our first parameter is defined, and then we give it a data type on how we're going to determine what type is coming into our routine. And then here we see a second parameter as well of the one being defined. So this particular one has two parameters coming into it, and we'll have those defined as different data types. Now the calling program calls it with the same name, and it passes into it the arguments to the parameters. In this case, the two parameters have to match up, both in data types as well as sequence on that. And so we'll do some kind of action through here, and then as we finish with the subroutine in here, we exit and come to the next statement after the calling line of code. Now let's take a look at functions. Functions are like subroutines, but they perform actions, but they also return a value on that. And we'll see that as we look at it. Once again, they are defined first by an access modifier, public, friend, or private. Most likely private for within a class, but sometimes we use the public to make it more available to other modules and classes on it as well. Also, a function can define one or more parameters, receive arguments from the calling code statement, just like subroutines. And a parameter list establishes the number of parameters, their type, and their sequence. just like subroutines. And once again, we can use the by val or by ref to define the parameters that we're going to have received into our function. Functions, though, are generally used to calculate a result of something. So we might do some kind of financial calculation or some other type of calculation in our program, and then we're going to return back with the returns keyword a value of our calculation back to the program. Now sometimes it's nothing more than returning back a Boolean value of true and false that something successfully occurred. And you must specify a data type for the returning value. And you'll see the whole function itself is defined as a data type. Now let's take a look at our generic example. Once again, we have a function name being called, and it's passing in the arguments like a subroutine. And here we see the function being defined. But the difference is there is an as returning data type, and we might have it as string or as integer or as double. Whatever we want to define is how we want this program to return a value. And then we have the return statement keyword returning some kind of value. This might be nothing more, as I said, as a true-false value, maybe of some successful action, or it might be a value of our calculation. And we see that I have defined up here a variable called result as a data type. Now this data type should match the returning data type of my function. And therefore when I call the function, it'll return a value and assign it to the variable called result in this case. So we'll see that in our program as well. The main thing to remember is we have to have an as data type for our function, and we use the return keyword normally in our code to return a value back to the calling code. Now there's some additional things we'll look at. Both of them, both subroutines and functions, are sometimes referred to as methods or procedures. And you'll see programmers and instructors use both terms, and sometimes it's confusing, but remember that both of those terms, methods and procedures, do apply to subroutines and functions. Now a subroutine may have an event associated with it, and you're probably very well aware of this. For example, we have a lot of times a button that we put in our program, and it has a click event that we add to that subroutine, so that when that button is clicked, we call that subroutine. And that's called an event procedure, and it is nothing more than a subroutine that has the handles keyword. We can also use the add handler line of code as well to refer and activate a subroutine based off of some kind of event. And both subroutines and functions can change variables outside their local scope. If the variable, though, is defined outside the subroutine or procedure with an access modifier making them available. For example, if I have a variable at the class level defined, that class level variable will be available to all the different routines within my class. And therefore I can modify that variable in my particular subroutine or function, and it will be changed as a result of whatever I might do in that routine or function. And if I pass into a subroutine or function a variable with the by ref keyword, that also will allow that function or subroutine to change that variable, and that variable will be modified, and the other, as it exits the program, or I should say exits that subroutine or function, that variable which might have undergone a change will be reflected outside the subroutine or procedure. Okay, let's take a look at our program. And I'm going to click on over here, and get our program up. And I have defined a very simple Windows program, and I've got two text boxes with the alignment defined as center, and I have two labels that have been defined here for the outputs of processing these two text boxes. So we'll basically be doing an addition routine or function in our calculations, and each one will go to the different actual labels that we have here defined as output. Now we have three buttons that I have defined: the process subroutine, the process function, and the clear. And we'll take a look at that in our code. And also you'll see that I've already defined in my code using the to-do reserved words in the Visual Studio environment, my tasks that I have before me. And so we'll see how that I get these tasks done in our video. Okay, let's take a look at our program itself. And I'm going to click on the code, and let's take a look. Okay, let me first of all draw your attention to our documentation, and our screen image, if you'd like to take a look at it, is out there at Enter. And also the code for this particular lesson is at Pastebin. So if you'd like to stop your video at this point in time and write those down so you can go out and take a look at them, please do so, and then restart the video. So here we have our program, and we're going to be doing some different things. And first of all, I have hidden right now a class level variables that I'll need to define on that. And let's take a look at the code. The first one that I had was the subroutine button click event, and I'm going to do some code for that, and I'm going to call that subroutine add two numbers. The second one that I'm going to create in this particular section is to use a function, and I'm going to use add two nums for my function name on that. And let me take you on down to the ones that have already been defined in this. The clear button is actually a subroutine, and it has attached to it the handles keyword, which makes this a event procedure so that when the clear button click event occurs, this subroutine occurs. So we are probably already accustomed to subroutines, and here we see we're doing a number of methods. We're doing the clear method, and we're setting the properties of the text properties of these two labels to a string empty value. And then we're moving our cursor to the first text box with the focus method. So here we actually see a routine that receives in a couple of parameters and processing the action through the lines of code, and then exiting the sub. And then the final one that I have here already defined is the first and second int text boxes when the text change event occurs on them. In other words, when somebody begins to type in the text boxes, I want to automatically clear out my labels, my labels of the calculations, so that we know that they have undergone a change. And until I press the buttons related to the different functions or subroutines, I want to have those values empty. And down below, we'll be coding in our two routines, the add two numbers subroutine and our code for add two nums function. So let's take a look at how to code in the first one. Let's start with this one, and what we're going to do on this one is we're going to find a field called result, and I'm going to use result for my output, and I'm going to first begin by going to the class level variable for this one, and I'll show you what is going on in this. So I'm going to dim a field, dimension a field, result as string. And this will make it a variable that's available throughout every part of this class on that. So I've declared a variable called result as string. Now, what I'm going to do in the actual routine is I'm going to make certain result is cleared out before I use it. I'm going to use the string empty on that. So that clears out the result. And then I want to call the routine for add two numbers. So all I need to do is use the statement like this. And since I haven't defined it yet, we'll see this error up as I type it in. And what I'm going to be passing into it is my first int text box text property and my second int text box text. And we'll see this error up because I have not yet defined that routine, so that's where we get these squiggly lines underneath on that. And then after I call that, I'm going to take the value of my result and I'm going to output it to my subroutine result value label text, and I'll put the result in that field. Okay, so we're going to have to define now or add two numbers for this particular one. So let's take a look at this one, and I'm going to come down below and we'll actually define this particular routine. Let me come down to our code, and we will begin this with a private, since I'll only need it in this class, and it's going to be a subroutine, so we use private sub. Then I'm going to put in the name of what I called it, add two numbers, and then I'm going to use the by val, and then I'm going to have the first value as string because it's the text property and I'm passing in a string, and by val value 2 as string. Okay, so I've got my subroutine defined, and in that subroutine I'm going to process value 1 and value 2. And what I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to check first of all to make certain that I have keyed in a correct number. So I'm going to declare for this num1 and num2 as integers for my calculation. Whoops, I didn't spell that right. See if I get it right there. And then I'm going to say if not, and then I'm going to use integer try parse, and I'm going to try parse value 1, and I want to return back num1 as I process that. And if I process it correctly, I'll have a value of whatever was passed in. It'll be assigned to num1 as an integer. But if it turns out that value 1 was not able to be parsed as an integer, maybe I entered in a string value with a name in it instead of a number that could be converted to a number, I have to give back a message stating that we have a problem. So what I'm going to do is say result, which is available at my class level. I'm going to give it back a message of first value is not an integer. Okay, so that takes care of my first value, and I'll do the same thing. So I'll just copy this code, and we'll use num2, value 2 coming in on this one, and we'll say second value on it. So now I've validated the code on that, and now we're going to process that code that we want to do. And so I'm going to use my class level variable equals, and I'm going to put in parentheses num1 plus num2. And because this could be long, I want to convert it to a string from being an integer, I add the toString method at the end. And sometimes you'll see the parentheses around it like that. So at this point, it'll come in, passing from the text boxes. Value 1 will receive the first text box. Value 2 will receive the second text box values. Then we'll come through and check to make certain that they were in fact numbers that I can convert to integer. And if they pass through correctly, then I'm going to process the addition of these two values, putting it into the result field, which was defined at our class level as a string. And so I put the toString method at the end. So let's see this particular part run at this point in time. Let's go back up. Let's compile it. And I'm going to hit the start. And we'll see our program up and running here. And I'll put in 5 and 15. And I'll hit the subroutine process button. And we should see a value of 20 being returned. And that's exactly what's happening in this particular case. And that's what we want to see happen. Okay, let's take a look now at doing a function. Okay, function's very similar. In fact, this particular program lends itself better to a function. And so we're coming up to the area where we're going to use the function. And this one is much easier to code, and you'll see this one simply as this. We're just going to take function result value label text, and we're going to return to it the value of our function. And our function is going to be add to nums, and we're going to pass into it once again the first text box text property and the second text property. Much simpler statement than up above in one sense, because up above I had to have a result field defined and to put it in the result field in my subroutine and then output it to my label. Here we can go right to the process of calculating the value in the function, and the function returns back a value that can go directly to our label. So now let's code our toNums function. So I'm going to copy this part in and come on down to our lower level, and I'm going to code in this one, and once again I'll use the private keyword as a modifier. Then I'll use the word function, and then I'll put in the name that I called up above, and here once again I'm going to use the by val value 1 as string and by val value 2 as string. Now the difference on a function is I have to have as, and then I have to give it a data type, and I'm going to return back a data type of string because I want to put it into the text box up above. So I'm going to have a string data type return. Now we have to define what we're going to be doing in this, and it's very similar. So I'm going to steal some code from above here, copy and paste this in. on that. So we'll process this, but the difference is instead of using result, I'm going to return. You'll see that change. I don't need the result field. It'll return back to my function. Since I am using a string, this is an easy way to do it. And then if everything comes out correctly, instead of having this as result equals num2, all I have to do is copy this down here, change this and say return on that. And this will process it back and it'll return a string, which is the string here, back to our calling program up above on that where we called it. It'll return a string and put it right into our label. So let's see this one run. Okay, let me make it a little bit bigger for you. And we'll run this one. I'll put in 20 and 10 for my second one and hit now the process function button, and it gives me 30 just as my subroutine one did on it. So both of these work correctly processing the value. But I want you to notice the simplicity of the function for this one because it is trying to deal with calculating a result. Now, I talked about at the very beginning the idea that we had a class level variable here that I was using for my particular way of dealing with handling the subroutine. Now, let me, for a moment, comment this out. I'm going to put an asterisk in front of it. And what I'm going to do is dimension a value here of it at the local level of this code, dim result as string. So I've defined it there in my code. Now it's not available at this point in my subroutine. You'll see it down below my subroutine with errors because it's not available. But I can modify this, and I can change this and pass to it by reference. I'll make it value 3 as string. Okay. And what I'll do is change this one to value 3. Change this one to value 3. And change this one to value 3. There we go. So what I'm doing is passing in the result field that I defined up in the local block of the routine. It passes the actual memory location of this value to this symbolic name and processes it, and that symbolic name gets changed, which actually changes in memory the value that we had, and the result value at the top will be changed. So now I need to pass in the same number of parameters, so I need to pass in result as well. Whoops. Get my fingers on the right keys. There now. So I'm passing in 3 parameters, one of which is defined here as result as string, being passed in. But the difference is instead of using the by val in here, I'm using the by reference on as I pass in, and that can then be modified and returned back. So let's see that one work and make certain it really does work as I said it should. Okay, let me start that. And let's see this in our code. So let's add 25, and we'll make it 5. And let's try that subroutine with the change. And yes, it works, just as the function works. So we can use the by ref value to pass into our routines as well. The important thing to remember as we do that is that we define the data types correctly. We pass in the same number of parameters into our routine. So we have 3 here being passed in, and they're coming into our routine below and being processed in this particular, I should say, in the add 2 numbers subroutine, and processing it through. And then since value 3 is being modified and it is a by ref type, the value goes back to the calling statement with that change, and that variable has undergone a change, and we can use that variable that we defined up above and use it as well. So we can use it at the class level and modify things at the class level, or we can make it a one in the module itself, but passing it in as a by reference. And that can also be done for functions. So not only does a function return a result, but it can change other variables too. We have to use the by ref keyword in that to process that change. So hopefully you appreciate a little bit of change that part of our coding routine. The important thing to remember as we look at subroutines and functions, the purpose of them are to modularize our code, to make it smaller in little chunks of code that we can test and know work correctly. Also, they hide data. It's called data hiding. Basically, we're passing in with our arguments into the function or procedure the values that we want to work with. The function or procedure works on it, does whatever it needs to, and in the case of a function, passes back a value, and keeps everything hidden in the particular subroutine or function from the rest of the code. And then as it finishes its action, allows the rest of the code to continue on after the statement that called it. So it helps break down things that we do over and over again, isolate things where we need to undergo changes like computing a result, and also do action over and over again. So we break up our code into smaller sections. So remember that a function and a subroutine are very much alike. The difference is a function returns back a value, and we have to define a function with the data type. So good luck in your programming. Get your hands dirty in the code and have fun. Until next time, take care.